Hello, everyone. Welcome to session 12 of our course. Today we are talking about Batakapilani, who is the nun who is foremost in recollection of past lives, and she's also Mahakassapa's wife. Before we start, I have to let you know, I just got my second Pfizer shot a few days ago, and I'm still feeling very woozy. So we'll see how it goes today. And so Batakapilani is a very interesting character. First of all, because of course she's Mahakassapa's wife, and we have seen that Mahakassapa, he had quite misogynistic views. We saw that when we read in our first session, when we read the account of the first council, he or his supporters, his group, had quite strong opinions about the inferiority of women. They were quite opposed to bhikkhuni ordination. But then he has a wife, and a wife who is a bhikkhuni and one of the foremost bhikkhunis. So it's quite an interesting combination. And then also, of course, in some ways, Mahakassapa and Bhaddā are somewhat comparable to the Buddha and Yashodhara, because they're also one of the foremost couples. And of course, in some ways, Kassapa is the successor of the Buddha in an informal way. He took charge of the sangha when the Buddha had passed away. He was the one who convened the first council, who presided over the first council, who was then in control of the text. So it's kind of interesting to compare this couple with the Buddha and Yasodhara. So this is what we're going to do today. And before we start, we will chant the Namo Tassa as usual, and feel free to join me if you'd like to chant along. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Buddhang Dhammang Sanghang Namasami. So I will share my screen and then we can start right away. So today we are going to look at the only early source we have about Batakapilani, which is her Therīgāthā poem, Therīgāthā 4.1. Then we are going to look at her apadāna in the Pali text, Pali school, which has very strong links to the Therīgāthā poem, but which sort of develops the tendencies that we see in the poem in a very unique way, very unusual way. And then we are going to have a look at the Vinaya text. So Bhaddā is someone who appears very frequently in the Vinaya text. And there is a very distinct difference in the way she's presented in the Pali Bhikkhuni Vinaya and in the way she's presented in every other Vinaya, every non-Pali Vinaya, including the Sanskrit and the Chinese versions. And I think there are probably some things we can draw out by comparing these two versions. And yeah, so this is what we're going to do today. And as I just mentioned, Bhaddā in all the sources, both in the Pali and in the Chinese sources, is the nun who is foremost in recollection of past lives. And also in all the schools, she is presented as Mahakassapa's wife. So all schools present the idea that she and Kassapa were a married couple. So here is her poem, and it goes as follows. Kassapa is the son and heir of the Buddha, whose mind is immersed in samadhi. He knows his past lives and sees heaven and places of loss, and has attained the end of rebirth. That sage has perfect insight. It's because of these three knowledges that the Brahmin is a master of the three knowledges. In exactly the same way, Batakapilani is a master of the three knowledges, destroyer of death. She bears her final body, having vanquished Mara and his mount. Seeing the danger of the world, both of us went forth. Now we are tamed, our defilements have ended, we've become cooled and quenched. So this is a very unusual poem. We can see the first two stanzas here. Don't talk about Bhaddā at all. They only talk about Mahakassapa. This is very unusual for the Therīgāthā. In the Therīgāthā, it's very, very rare that the nuns talk about the monks. Except for the Buddha himself, I think monks very, very rarely appear in the Therīgāthā. I remember one poem where a bhikkhunī admonishes and teaches a bhikkhu, who is her son. So this is Bhaddā Mata's poem, and Bhaddā Mata is teaching Bhaddā, who is also a bhikkhu. And then by the teaching of his mother, he's able to attain arahantship. And I remember another poem where a nun, when she was a lay person, received a teaching from a bhikkhu. And then because of that teaching, I think she became a nun. But other than that, it's extremely rare that a bhikkhu would appear in the Therīgāthā. And we really get the impression that the ancient bhikkhunīs were quite separate as a sangha from the bhikkhu sangha. But here, this is really one poem that stands out because a bhikkhu is praised so much. So again, it seems like Bhaddā still has a very strong connection, even though both of them have gone forth and they are no longer to be considered married or a family. She still has a very strong connection to her former husband, to Mahakassapa. And it has often been pointed out that this is a rhetorical device that Bhaddā uses to her advantage, because Kassapa is one of the foremost monks. He's extremely popular. So she starts off her poem by praising him, and that creates an emotional connection with her audience. And everybody thinks, oh, this woman says very smart things. She is praising this amazing monk. And then she twists it around and says, I am exactly as powerful as this foremost monk, as this amazing monk. So because she says, in exactly the same way, I am a master of the three knowledges. So this is a way of making a very strong statement as a woman, she is able to be as powerful as one of the most powerful monks. So here she is praising a monk, and it seems a little bit over the top maybe, but she's just using it to get the point across that as a woman, she's able to attain the exact same thing. And then the last stanza, she says, seeing the danger of the world, both of us went forth. So here she lets us know that they went forth together, and they went forth because they, especially both of them, including her, had a very genuine spiritual vocation. So she didn't go forth because her husband went forth and she felt lonely at home, but she really went forth because she wanted to attain the end of rebirth, because she saw the disadvantages of living in samsara. And I think many people will be familiar with the story of the commentarial story of Bhaddā and Mahakassapa going forth. This is again a very popular story found in many of the schools, not only in the Pali version. In that story, we know that Bhaddā and Mahakassapa, they were both from Brahmin families. And both of them, even when they were very young, had the wish to go forth and not to get married. So when the parents set up the marriage, both of them sent letters to each other, asking each other not to get married and to find another husband or wife, another partner, because they wanted to go forth. But the parents were really adamant that they get married, so they intercepted the letter and exchanged them with love letters. And so they ended up getting married, but they never consummated the marriage, and they lived together as brother and sister. And when the parents had passed away, they were free to go forth. And they went forth together, and but then they parted ways because they thought it was unsuitable for a man and a woman to be together when they are ascetics. And they went forth in the first year of the Buddha's dispensation. So when the Buddha had just started teaching, at the first opportunity that they had to get the true Dhamma. So their karma was very strong. And Mahakassapa immediately encountered the Buddha and became a monk and became an arahant. What happened to Bhaddā is a little bit different in the different schools. According to the Pali school, she had to stay in a non-Buddhist residence for female monastics. So she stayed with non-Buddhist renunciants for 5 years until Mahapajapati came along and started a bhikkhuni order. And then when the bhikkhuni order had been founded, she became a bhikkhuni and became fully enlightened. According to other sources, especially I think in the Mula Savasivada tradition or the Savasivada tradition, that doesn't happen to her. She encounters the Buddha and she gets ordained with an Ehi bhikkhuni ordination. So Ehi bhikkhuni ordination, we've talked about this before when we talked about Batakundalakesa, is the ordination where the Buddha says, come bhikkhuni, and then she automatically gets ordained in that way. So that would make Batakapilani obviously a very, very early bhikkhuni, and much earlier than the story of Mahapajapati. And so Bhaddā is one of the candidates that we think could have been the first bhikkhuni or one of the first bhikkhunis who might be an alternative to Mahapajapati founding the bhikkhuni order. Because we have stories, not in the Pali tradition, but in the Savasivada or Mula Savasivada tradition. So this is her early poem. She is quite a strong woman. She's a bold woman. She declares her arahantship in a very strong, unequivocal way. She makes it clear that she had a genuine spiritual vocation. But also she shows her connection to Mahakassapa, which is still very strong. And especially this connection with Mahakassapa is now developed in a very strong way in her apadāna, and also in a very unusual way in her apadāna. So we are going to have a look at that now. And the apadāna, as usual, starts in the time of Padumuttara Buddha. And the apadāna is also very long, so we are going to skip a few passages. And it begins as follows. The victor Padumuttara was one with eyes for everything. That leader of the world was born 100,000 eons hence. There was then in Hangsavati a leader known as Videha, a millionaire with many gems. I was the wife of him back then. So that leader, that millionaire, is obviously Kassapa in a former life. Once, accompanied by servants, he went up to the human sun and listened to the Buddha's teaching, causing all suffering to end. The leader praised the follower who was top in austerities. Hearing, he is the millionaire, gave alms for a week to the Buddha, the neutral one. Bowing his head at Buddha's feet, he aspired to that foremost place, causing his retinue to smile. Right then, that bull among people, having pitied the millionaire, spoke these verses aloud to him. You will attain the wished-for state, O son, you'll achieve nirvana. In 100,000 eons, arising in Okaka's clan, the one whose name is Gotama will be the teacher in the world. Worthy heir of that one's Dhamma, Dhamma's legitimate offspring, the one whose name is Kassapa will be the teacher's follower. So here we have Kassapa in a former life, being a millionaire. He goes to the Buddha Padumuttara. He sees that another disciple, another bhikkhu, is the foremost in ascetic practices, and he aspires to become someone like this in a future life. And his retinue smiles, obviously because he's a millionaire and he's very much indulgent in sense pleasures, and he's the opposite of an austere ascetic practitioner. But still, the Buddha gives him the confirmation that he will attain this place. And then, gladdened after hearing that, as long as he lived, he then served with requisites the victor guide, with a heart that was full of love, lighting up the dispensation, crushing the dirty heretics, instructing those who could be taught. He passed on with his followers. So the Buddha passed on, not the millionaire. And when that world chief reached nirvana, assembling his kinsmen and friends to do puja to the teacher, with them he then had constructed a stupa. So the millionaire constructed the stupa, which was made of gems rising up 7 leagues in height. So 1 league is not quite clear how long a league is. Some people estimate it's roughly 10 kilometers. So we're not quite sure, but that's a rough like ballpark figure. So 7 leagues is very high. Obviously an exaggeration. Which blazed forth just as does the sun, like a regal salt tree in bloom. And now we have a very long description of how amazing that stupa was, full of gems and full of perfumes and banners and ornaments and lots of other things. And then having performed puja like that, lovely for the excellent one, he gave the monks community alms as much as he could his whole life. So we are now on page 3 of this apadāna, and this is Bhaddā's apadāna, but the only person who is being talked about so far is Mahakassapa, which is obviously remarkable. This doesn't happen in any other apadāna of any other of the foremost nuns. And it's always Kassapa who is going to the Buddha, Kassapa who is making merit, Kassapa who is building up that stupa. And it's also very remarkable that it is Kassapa who gets the prediction of being a future foremost disciple of the Buddha Gautama, when rightfully this should be Bhaddā who should be getting that prediction, because Bhaddā is also a foremost nun. Bhaddā is the one foremost in recollecting past lives. So this is what her apadāna should be about. This is what we see in any other apadāna of any other of the foremost nuns. They get a prediction, but here Bhaddā does not get a prediction. Only Mahakassapa is the one who gets the prediction. So now finally she appears, and the stanza says, along with that millionaire, I, as long as I lived, also did those merit-filled deeds thoroughly, and with him I had good rebirths. So she's basically just an afterthought to everything that Kassapa does. So Kassapa does, and she kind of follows along. And she has to do that because just like the Buddha and Yashodhara, in the Pali tradition, Kassapa and Bhaddā are also a couple whose fate was intertwined for many, many, many eons and who had rebirths together. So of course, to have rebirths together, she needs to have the same merit that Kassapa has. So she kind of tags along and sort of does the same things, but she has no agency of her own. She's just following the man. And then she says, experiencing happiness, both as a human and a god, I was reborn along with him like a shadow with the body. So obviously Kassapa is the body. She's just the shadow. She doesn't have an existence of her own, basically. She's just following the man. So this is very different from her early poem, where she used the praise of Kassapa as a rhetorical device to make a bold statement about the abilities of women. But here that is turned around and everything is focused on Kassapa. And this is not to state the abilities of women, but to kind of really make the woman just as a sort of like an appendix to the man, like a little thingy that follows along. And then the next Buddha arises, Buddha Vipassi. The leader known as Vipassi arose 91 eons ago. Buddha delightful to the eye, one with insight into all things. Then he lived in Bandumati, a Brahmin known for excellence. So of course, this is Kassapa again, rich in scripture and religion, but very poor in terms of wealth. And at that time, of the same mind, I was his Brahmin woman wife. Once that excellent twice-born man met with the sage who was so great, seated amidst the population, preaching the state of deathlessness. Hearing the Dhamma overjoyed, he gave his own cloak to that sage. Going home in a single cloth, he spoke these words to me just then, take joy in this great good karma, the cloak given to the Buddha. Then clasping hands together, I, well satisfied, did take delight. Husband, this cloak is gifted well to the best Buddha, neutral one. So again, it is Kassapa who meets Buddha Vipassi. It is Kassapa who makes the offering, and she is staying at home and she is sort of just doing the rejoicing. Again, she's not the one acting. And then there's another rebirth. He is reborn as, we're like skipping a little bit ahead now. He is reborn as a king. She is his chief queen. And there were 8 Pacheka Buddhas, and he's giving a big course, the alms. Of course, he is giving the alms. He is making a pavilion. He is offering, and she also follows along. And then there's a new rebirth. Now, this is an interesting rebirth here, because this time she's not Mahakassapa's wife. So she says, again, I was reborn in a village outside the Kasi gate. He was happy with his brothers in a wealthy clan of families. I was the eldest brother's wife, a woman who fulfilled her vows. So she is the older brother's wife, and Kassapa is the younger brother. Having seen a lonely Buddha is a Pacceka Buddha. He who was my younger brother, so Kassapa, gave his portion to that Buddha. When he arrived, I told him that. So Kassapa is giving alms to the Pacceka Buddha, and when her husband, the older brother, arrived, she told the husband. And the husband did not praise that alms giving. So having taken back the food from Buddha, I gave it to him. So she takes the alms back from the Buddha and gives it to the husband. And then again, he gave it to him, gave him it himself. So the husband then gives the alms to the Buddha back, also he gives it back to the Buddha. And then she gets angry because of this back and forth. Then, having thrown away that food, enraged, I took back Buddha's bowl a second time, filled it with mud, and gave it to that neutral one. So she grabs back the food because now she's angry and fills up the bowl with mud. And right when he received those alms, rotten and lacking purity, his mind was equally happy. Seeing that, I was very moved. So the Buddha didn't show any reaction to that. And again, I took that bowl from him and cleaned it with scented perfume. With my mind then full of pleasure, I gave him ghee respectfully. So then she regrets what she did, and she gives him a proper alms offering. And then, in whichever place I'm reborn, because I gave alms, I'm gorgeous. Through giving Buddha tasteless food, my breath has a horrible stench. So for the first time here, we see Bhaddā acting of her own accord, not following her husband or not following the brother or whoever Kassapa is in this story, but making her own decision. But finally, when she makes her own decision, she makes a wrong decision. So she offers mud to a Buddha. She gets angry with a Buddha and she offers mud to a Buddha. So she's making bad karma. So again, this shows us here in this story, for the woman, it's better to tag along with the husband and not to have her own agency and not to act in her own way, but because when she does, then she makes a wrong decision and she makes a lot of bad karma. And of course, this is extremely different from what we've seen last week when we compared Yasodhara's apadāna, when we read Yasodhara's apadāna. And of course, Yasodhara and the Buddha had a very, very different relationship. We saw how much they were shown to be equals, how much they were shown to be real partners, and how much Yasodhara had her own agency and did her own actions and made her own merit. So we maybe you remember there were those long lists of all the various meritorious deeds that Yasodhara did. And the way she was presenting that in the apadāna was that she went up to the Buddha and she listed all these long, these extensive actions that she had done, and she was calling the Buddha to witness that. So she was acting and the Buddha was bearing witness. So she was the active one and the Buddha was the passive one. And she was also very independent from the Buddha. She made her own decisions, her own merit. And the Buddha sort of only witnessed. He might not even have been present at that time. So it's very, very different. Their relationship is very, very different. It's much, much more equal than that between Bhaddā and Kassapa. And one theory that has sometimes been put forward to explain that is that, of course, the Buddha and Yasodhara came from the Khattiya clan, the warrior clan, whereas Bhaddā and Kassapa came from a Brahmin clan. And we know that the situation of women changed after the Buddha's time, but it might not have changed in all classes of society in the same way. So it's very likely that this started in the for the Brahmins first, so that for the Brahmins, first the status of women declined quite rapidly, quite quickly, and that in other groups of society, the other case, things would have remained equal much longer. So for that reason, it seems that for Brahmins, an ideal marriage would be a very domineering male personality with a very submissive female personality. Whereas for the Khattiyas, a much more equal relationship was seen as an ideal marriage. So that is one possible explanation why those two couples are portrayed in such a different way, even though both of them are quite respected couples, and the tradition certainly didn't want to put anyone down here. Certainly they wanted to tell an inspiring story, not a story that is detrimental to their characters. So here we might see an example how the different castes, the different classes in society had very different approaches towards women. And then the story continues. There's Kassapa Buddha, and his stupa was being completed, and when the stupa was being made, she donates a tile, and then she applies scented perfumes to that tile so that that horrible stench goes away eventually. So she gives a lot of offerings there. And then the story kind of picks up. We're skipping ahead a little bit again. There is Sumita, a well-known sage, and she's the wife, and he gives to lonely Buddhas, and she shares that marriage. Then he is reborn as a Kolian, and he again attends upon Pacheka Buddhas, 500 Pacheka Buddhas with all kinds of alms, and she follows along. Then he becomes the King Nanda, and she becomes the chief queen, and then he becomes King Brahmadatta, and he did all sorts of meritorious action towards Pacheka Buddhas, another 500 Pacheka Buddhas, and she too tags along. And then finally, now we come to the last life. So they were reborn both in the Brahma world and then fallen down to Mahatita. He is well-born Pippalayana. So Pippali is another name for Kassapa. And his mother was Sumana Devi, and his father was the Brahmin Kosigota. And in the mother country, I was daughter of Brahmin Kapila. Mother was Suchimati, in Sagala, the best of cities. And my father, having adorned me with a thick golden ornament, gave me to the wise Kassapa, who avoided desire for me. So this is now the story that we also see in the commentaries, which I've told in the beginning. The two of them get married, even though they don't really want to. But in her apadāna story, it's only Kassapa who has avoided desire for her. It's not stated that she also avoided desire for him, so that the relationship was kind of mutual. They had the same aspirations, the same ideas. But in this apadāna story, it's again just told from Kassapa's perspective. And then one time, that compassionate man, gone forth, wishing for karma's end, was moved at seeing some creatures devoured by crows and such like birds. So here he hasn't gone forth into homelessness yet. He's just gone out, or like he's just gone for a walk. He's still a lay person. And then she too, in the house was moved, seeing worms that had been born in sesame, then baked by sun heat, being eaten up by some crows. When the wise Kassapa had renounced, I followed him in renouncing. For 5 years, I resided then along the path of renouncers. So here, again, unlike in her poem, they go forth together. Here, Kassapa goes forth first, and she follows him. Of course, this belongs to the Pali tradition. So she doesn't get ordained with bhikkhunī. She has to stay for 5 years with non-Buddhist ascetics, female ascetics, before she can ordain, because she has to wait for Mahapajapati to come. and start the female sangha. So when Gautami, the victor's nurse, had gone forth as a renouncer, then come together with Buddha, I too received his instructions. So finally, after 5 years, she also becomes a bhikkhuni. After not a very long time, I achieved the Arahant state, being the beautiful friend of the resplendent Kassapa. So again, she celebrates her Arahantship, but the way she celebrates is that now she is finally a beautiful friend to Kassapa. So she celebrates her own Arahantship as something that boosts sort of Kassapa's standing in the Sangha, because now his wife has also attained. And now here, the next 4 stanzas is a repetition of her poem, her Therīgāthā poem. This is an exact quote, so we don't have to go through that again. And then the last 3 here are just stock passages. We see that in many of the apadānas. This is a celebration of her powers, a celebration of her arahantship. So here, as you can see, her apadāna is very unusual in that it doesn't really focus on Bhaddā. It really focuses only on Mahakassapa mainly. And she's very much seen as as she describes herself, as a shadow to the body. She's very much just seen as the shadow. So this is very unusual. On the other hand, this is something that this idea that Brahmin relationships or Brahmin marriages were quite different from Khattiya marriages, where the partners were much more equal, is something that comes up in different forms in different constellations. And one thing where we will see that again is next week. Next week is our last session, and next week we are talking about Tulananda. And Tulananda is the epitome of a bad nun. She's the foremost in misbehavior in all Buddhist schools. And the way that is seen most prominently is that she has a very bad relationship with Mahakassapa. And she also has a bad relationship with Batakapilani. And we are going to explore that much more in detail next week. But it is in one of the sources, it is said that she is a Khattiya woman. And also from her behavior, the way her behavior is described is she's much more independent, she's very outspoken. She is really someone who stands up to men also. And of course, if Mahakassapa as a Brahmin has a completely different idea of how women should behave, that would make their relationship very difficult. And this is something which we'll explore more next week. So this whole idea of there being very different conceptions between Brahmin women and Khattiya women is something that we will explore in detail next week. And that might be one of the reasons why Tulananda was cast in this role as a very bad person by the people who preserved the text in the beginning, the followers of Mahakassapa, who were mainly Brahmins, who had mainly had that idea of women who should be more submissive. And Tulananda didn't fit that mold at all. So this is something that will come up again next week. And in preparation for that, Tulananda, because she's a misbehaving nun, mostly appears in Vinaya texts. So in preparation for that, we are also going to look at Bhaddā's Vinaya text today, because as I mentioned, Tulananda and Bhaddā also had a bad relationship. So Bhaddā's appearance in the Vinayas is very interesting. And also her role is extremely different in the Pali Vinaya and in all the other Vinayas. So normally when nuns appear in the Vinaya, that means that they are misbehaving nuns. So the fact that Bhaddā appears all over the Vinaya is not really a promising thing. But in the Pali Vinaya, she has a very positive role, or at least she doesn't have a negative role. So we are having a look at that now and then compare with the non-Pali Vinaya. When we look at Vinaya, of course, there are all the rules, but every rule has an origin story that explains how that rule was laid down, like the events that happened, how someone misbehaved or whatever happened, and then people complained, and the Buddha heard about it and laid down a rule. So from these origin stories, we can see a little bit about the social context in which those nuns lived and the expectations that lay people or other nuns had about them and about their behavior. So first of all, we are now looking at Pachitya rules. Pachitya rules are fairly minor rules. And the first one we're looking at is 33 and 35. Here we're not reading the entire origin story because this is one where Bhaddā interacts with Tulananda. So we are looking into this more next time. But I just wanted to point out how Bhaddā is described here. And it says, Batakapilani was a learned reciter who was confident and skilled at giving teachings, and she was respected for her excellence. Because of this, people visited Batakapilani. So this is Batakapilani's description in the Pali Vinaya. And here she's really an amazing, outstanding teacher. So she's described in very, very glowing terms. There's no hint of her being in any way a misbehaving nun. But she does appear in other rules, and the way she appears is very interesting because it's so different from all the other schools. So Pachitya 11 says, at one time when the Buddha was staying at Savatthi in Anatta Pindika's monastery, a male relative of a nun who was a pupil of Batakapilani went from his own village to Savatthi on some business. Then in the dark of the night and without a lamp, that nun stood and talked alone with that man. The nuns of few desires complained and criticized her. How can a nun do such a thing? And then the rule is laid down. So here it's not Bhaddā herself who is misbehaving. It's actually a pupil of her who's hanging out with a man in the dark. And then the pupil obviously didn't get the message that she shouldn't hang out with a man, because then in the next rule, again, the same male relative comes to Savatthi, and the same nun who was a pupil of Batakapilani, while she, knowing that the Buddha had prohibited standing or talking alone with a man in the dark of the night without a lamp, he instead stood and talked alone with that man in a concealed place. And then the rule is laid down, and then when she knew that the Buddha had prohibited standing or talking alone with a man in a concealed place, she instead stood and talked alone with that man out in the open. So one rule after another has to be laid down because that pupil of Batakapilani doesn't get the message that she shouldn't be alone with a man. But Batakapilani herself isn't really involved. She's just mentioned in the rule, but she's not the one misbehaving. And then there is a Sangatisesa. A Sangatisesa obviously is a very serious rule. And that same nun who was a pupil of Batakapilani had an argument with the nuns and then went to her relative's village. Not seeing her pupil anywhere, Batakapilani asked the nuns, where's so-and-so? She's disappeared. She disappeared venerable after arguing with the nuns. My dears, her relatives live in such and such a village. Go there and look for her. The nuns went there, and when they saw her, they said to her, why did you go alone, venerable? We hope you weren't assaulted. I wasn't. The nuns of few desires complained and criticized her. How can a nun walk to the next village by herself? So again, it's not Bhaddā who's misbehaving, it's her pupil. And the way she's misbehaving is that she is, the problem here is walking alone. But what we see overall in all these Pachityas is that the nun is associating closely with lay people. Here in this case, she had an argument, and the first thing is she runs back to her family. And also she's associating with men. So she seems to be very close to lay people still. And she hasn't really properly gone forth in her mind yet. So she's not that much separated from lay people, and she's still mingling very much with men and with her relatives. But Bhaddā herself isn't involved in all that. She's just mentioned. And this is very different from the other schools. So now we are looking at the Mahasangika Vinaya. And these are the same rules or very similar rules. But this time it is Bhaddā herself who is the one who is the cause for the laying down of those rules. So here the Buddha was staying at Vesali. And in all the non-Pali Vinyas, Bhaddā is very much associated with Vesali, not with Savatthi, as we've seen just now. And at that time, Bhaddā Bhikkhuni went to her relative's house and sat in a secluded place together with her brothers and sisters' sons. The Bhikkhunis were upset and said, why does a renunciate sit with lay people in a hidden place like a lay person? And then the rule is laid down. And then Bhaddā doesn't get the message, and Bhaddā Bhikkhuni went to her relative's house again and whispered in the ears of her brothers and sisters' sons while standing within arm's reach. The slaves were upset and said, this renunciate whispers in their ears. Surely she speaks about our faults. So this time she stands very close with those lay people, with those male lay people, and she's whispering in their ears. And then the next rule, Bhaddā again goes to her relative's house, and when her brothers and sisters' sons were in a dark place without a lamp, she suddenly entered there without first announcing herself. Then her relatives felt ashamed. So these are obvious parallels to the Pali rules, but this time it is Bhaddā Bhikkhuni who is misbehaving, not the pupil. So it's not too far-fetched to think that the Pali version was changed in order to protect Bhaddā's reputation, and by extension then protect Mahakassapa's reputation, because since the two are so closely interlinked, any misbehavior of Bhaddā kind of falls back onto Kassapa and damages his reputation. Especially in a Brahmin context, where the woman is supposed to be very submissive and supposed to be listening to the husband, and the husband is supposed to have control over the woman. So it's very interesting to see Bhaddā in this role, in this misbehaving role, when she's a Brahmin woman and Mahakassapa is the one who's affected. And then we have a lot of rules that are very, very similar. Then Bhaddā Bhikkhuni rode in a nice high vehicle to go to her relative's house, and the lay people were upset. Then Bhaddā Bhikkhuni went to her relative's house holding an umbrella and wearing leather sandals. Then she went to her relative's house and climbed on a high-footed couch bed on which 2 or 3 layers of mats were spread out, because that is considered very luxurious. And then Bhaddā Bhikkhuni had gone to her relative's house again and saw that they were bathing. The women said to her, we will massage the venerable one's body and acquire some merit. The Bhikkhuni was graceful, and therefore the women wanted to see her body. She allowed them to massage it. Then they used all kinds of perfumes and oils and applied them on her body. The Bhikkhunis were upset and said, this renunciate still has many wishes. So again, this is considered way too luxurious. And then the Buddha has laid down the precept that it is not allowed to have lay women massage and wash a Bhikkhuni. Then Bhaddā Bhikkhuni had another Bhikkhuni massage her. And so she didn't get the message. First of all, she didn't get the message that she shouldn't stand around with laymen. Now she's not getting the message that she shouldn't be massaged. So instead of a lay woman, now she has a Bhikkhuni massage her. And then the Buddha lays down another rule, and then she has a Sikkamana massage her. And the Buddha lays down another rule, and then she has a Samaneri massage her. So she really doesn't have that renunciate mindset here. And she's constantly socializing and hanging out with lay people and indulging in all these sense pleasures that were considered quite luxurious and quite outrageous for renunciates to use. And of course, this is the way she's misbehaving is extremely interesting, because this is in direct opposition to Mahakassapa's foremost quality, being the most austere, the most ascetic monk. And she is the one who is completely indulging in all these sense pleasures and who's constantly hanging out with her relatives, constantly socializing with lay people. So this directly flies in the face of Mahakassapa's practice. Like if she was misbehaving in some other way, it wouldn't be that bad. But because she's misbehaving in this way, it really undermines Mahakassapa's authority. So it's very interesting that this is portrayed in the non-Pali Vinyas, while of course in the Pali Vinaya it was changed to her pupil so that Kassapa's reputation could be preserved. And then there's another story. Bhaddā Bhikkhuni put on a silk robe. So of course a silk robe again is quite luxurious. and went to her relative's house. On the road, she was caught in a rainstorm. The road became transparent like crystal, and her whole body was visible. A crowd of people walked around her, wanting to look at her, so she crouched down. And the student, depending on her, stood at her side to shield her off. So again, because she's indulging in this luxurious silk robe, now she's getting in trouble. And so far we have looked at the Mahasangika Vinaya. Now we are looking at some of the other Vinayas. And we have so many stories. I'm not even showing you all the stories. We have much more stories. But for reasons of time, I'm going to summarize some of the stories that we are having here now. So this is from the Savasivada Vinaya. There's Bhaddā, the Kāpilānī Brahmin woman, and her younger sister dies. So she visits the husband of the sister. And because it gets dark, she has to stay overnight. She doesn't dare to go back to the monastery anymore. So the husband has dubious intentions towards her because she stays overnight, and he misunderstands her intentions. Nothing really happens, and the next morning she escapes, but it was a very close call. And then she gets criticized for spending the night alone with a layman. So again, she's in lay people's house and alone and too close with a layman. And then we have the Dhammaguptakas Vinaya. Here we have two stories that are very similar. And here Batakapilani goes to her relative's house again. So in all the Vinayas, she's portrayed in exactly the same way. She's constantly in her relative's house. And here she guilt trips her relatives into giving her an extremely expensive cloth worth 100,000 panels of cotton cloth. And then they're very upset. This bhikkhuni takes without limit. And she should, even if a supporter offers it, she should still know moderation. So this is a rule about taking a heavy cloth. The next rule is exactly the same. Very, very similar origin story about taking a light cloth for the summer. So the first one is for the winter, the second one is for the summer. And Bhaddā, she's manipulating her relatives, she's guilt-tripping her relatives in order to get this really expensive cloth. And these rules appear in all of the Vinayas, and Bhaddā is associated with this rule in several of the Vinayas. In the Mahasangika Vinaya, again, she is also the one who is the cause for laying down these rules. But the origin story is slightly different. Now I've confused myself. Okay. So the origin story is slightly different. There was a merchant who came from the north, and he had a very expensive, thick woolen cloth, and he wanted to sell it, but it was way too expensive. Even the king couldn't afford it. So he got very depressed because he had made a big investment and couldn't sell the cloth. Then people advised him to go to Bhaddā. And Bhaddā, of course, Bhaddā asked, how much do you want for it? And he said, I want 100,000. Then without bargaining, she said to a student, go and tell my relatives to take 100,000 and give it to him. And then the people asked, have you sold that woolen cloth or not? And he answered, I have sold it. And they asked who took it, and he answered, the renunciant Bhaddā. So here again, we see how much she is still involved with the lay people. She still thinks the lay people's money is her own money, and she can make arrangements for the money, and she can sort of buy stuff with her relatives' money as though she still were a lay person. So again, we see she doesn't have that mindset. And the next rule, so this rule was about the heavy cloth. The next rule is again the same about the light cloth. There's a merchant from the south. He had a thin cloth with a swan pattern. He also wants 100,000. It's too expensive for the king, and Bhaddā buys it in the end with her relatives' money. Then there are different rules. Here there are two from Dhammaguptaka and the Mahishasaka Vinaya. So these are about Bhaddā again being too close with a man. Bhaddā has a an abscess on her body. Most Vinyas say on her thigh. And without informing anyone, without having a second woman present, she has a male doctor open it and treat it. And in one version, she gets attacked. In another version, she doesn't get attacked, but the other bhikkhunīs fear that she might have gotten attacked. So then they criticize her again for being alone with a man. So we see in all these vinyas, these are absolutely recurring topics over and over again, and I haven't even shown you all the rules, how Bhaddā is way, way, way too close to men, way, way, way too close to lay people, how she really doesn't have a renunciate mindset. And I think the story that summarizes that best is the one that I have put here in the bottom, and this one I'm going to read out in full. And this story says, the Buddha was staying at Savatthi. At that time, a bhikkhuni, this is another bhikkhuni, not Bhaddā, when the rains retreat at Savatthi had ended, came to Vesali and went to the house of the relatives of Bhaddā bhikkhuni. Her family members asked, where did you spend the rains? She answered, at Savatthi. They asked, what is good and bad about Savatthi? The bhikkhuni said, Jeta's grove has abundant flowers and fruits. The water in the ponds is pure and cool. The monastery is such and such. The world-honored one's residence is such and such. The venerable Sariputta and Mahamoggallana are such and such. The household of Sujata, this is Anathapindika, is such and such. So she paints this glowing picture of monastic life in Savatthi. And the supporters, so this is Bhaddā's relatives, said, this is true going forth. Now our Bhaddā was born here and gets old here, like a person without hand and feet. From the outset, she refused to go out. So again, Bhaddā, even though she's ordained, she's really like a lay person, not a renunciate mindset at all, hanging out with the relatives, not leaving the house. So this is obviously very interesting, what is happening here. In all Buddhist traditions, including all these schools that have these kind of vinyas, there are stories preserved of Bhaddā and Mahakassapa being a couple. So in all the versions, this should have influenced or impacted on Mahakassapa. But the Pali version is the only version where Bhaddā and Kassapa's fate is intertwined in the same way that Buddha and Yashodhara's fate was intertwined for many, many eons, for thousands or millions of lifetimes in the past. In most, or in all other traditions, or at least all other traditions where I've seen the text, this is not at all the case. In most other traditions, Bhaddā, because she's foremost in remembering past lives, there are stories about her recollecting the past lives. And in all those past lives, Kassapa doesn't appear at all. So in all those stories, Kassapa happens to be her husband in the last life, but that's more or less a coincidence. So the links between Bhaddā and Kassapa are much, much less strong in all the other traditions as compared to the Pali. So since Bhaddā and Kassapa is more of a coincidental reunion, it's not a marriage that was mandated by fate and that, you know, goes back through the eons. The influence that Bhaddā could have on Mahakassapa is sort of much less in the other traditions than it is in the Pali. So in the Pali, it's much more necessary to portray her in a good light because her links with Kassapa are so much more strong than they are in the non-Pali traditions. And I think this is one reason why Bhaddā can be portrayed in that way in the non-Pali traditions as opposed to the Pali tradition. And next time we will explore this whole topic of Vinaya a little bit more when we talk about Tulananda. And as I mentioned, Tulananda is a very different character from Bhaddā in some ways. In some ways, she's also similar. But she has this completely opposite relationship with Mahakassapa, a very difficult relationship with Mahakassapa. So I think that will be very interesting to explore next time. And what we've done today is a little bit a preparation also to understand better what is happening next time. So to sum up, in the early sources, Bhaddā was a fairly strong person who made a very strong claim about her attainments by using a rhetorical device of praising Mahakassapa. And and she also made it very clear that she had a very genuine spiritual vocation, that she went forth because she saw the suffering in the world. And in her Apadāna text, that praising of Mahakassapa was used in a way that her whole Apadāna started to focus only on Kassapa. And she was really relegated to a very, very submissive secondary position. So her position changed very much from her early poem to her Apadāna text. And then in the Vinyas, we see a completely different side of Bhaddā again. So in the Vinyas, it appears that she had very much trouble with her spiritual vocation, and that she was very, very attached to lay life. So it seems that in the non-Pali sources, she is depicted in a fairly or substantially different way from the Pali sources, where she is this genuine spiritual practitioner, and also where her connection with Mahakassapa is much more strong and goes back many, many more lives. So unfortunately, we are already out of time, and we are not able to look at more texts from Bhaddā. I just wanted to mention that there are also a lot of very beautiful stories about Bhaddā in the Chinese text. There's also one long story or long sutta in the Kottadā Agama that was translated by Bhante Nalayo, which is freely available on the internet, where she tells of a lot of her past lives, where Mahakassapa does not play any role at all, where she's entirely independent. And especially there, she is a layman, and that layman makes a lot of merit with one of the past Buddhas, with the express intention, with the aspiration to be reborn in a female body. So with the fruition of this meritorious act, that layman becomes a woman. And this is seen as a fruition of that extremely good karma that he has made from serving that Buddha. So again, this is an instance where we see that acquiring a female body can be a very, very meritorious karma. Unfortunately, we didn't have the time to look into that now, but if you want to read that, it's really available on the internet. I think the text is called Karma and Female Rebirth by Bhante Nalayo. You can download it and read it there. Very much recommended. And now if you have any questions or comments, then I will try my best to answer them. And I see Vanessa has typed in the chat, no problem, you can keep your video off, not a big deal. So does anyone have a question? Yes, Anna-Marie?
Hi, Aya, thank you very much. It seems that, from what I've heard, that when in past life stories, when people have relationships with each other, they always, well, I don't know, this is the question, but do they always keep the same gender in relation to each other, like husband and wife, or like I read about Mahakassapa and Ananda in past lives, they were always like brother, grandson, father. So do they also switch genders sometimes in previous lives?
So from like what I know, there are stories about people switching gender, but if the past life story is about a relationship, such as between Buddha and Yashodhara, or between Mahakassapa and Bhaddā, then usually they don't switch the gender. So in the Pali versions of those stories, where they have these these marriages that go back a long time, and where in every life they are together again, then they don't switch gender. But in Chinese sources where Bhaddā is independent, for example, or we have seen last time there was Batakapilani, who might be another name for Yashodhara. When they are alone, there are many stories where people switch gender. We even have stories of the Buddha being a female in a past life. But if the whole point of the story is to show that they are an ideal couple that formed their relationship over many, many lifetimes, then I have not heard of any story where they did actually switch gender. Is there any other question? Okay, if there's no other question, then we can finish for today. Next time we are talking about Tulananda. Next time will also be our last session. And if you have the time, I really highly recommend that you check out Karma and Female Rebirth from Bhante Analayo, and you read that story, because I think it's really very interesting, and it's such a pity that we didn't have the time to read it today. I love that story very much. So highly recommend it. And for today, we can finish with 3 sadhus as usual. Feel free to join me if you'd like. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And I'll see you all next time.
Thank you. That was good.
Thank you.
I'm glad you enjoyed.